I am not an expert in the employment area of federal law, but I do have some familiarity with it as a veteran, as somebody who these statutes and the act applies to. So I thought it would be a great video to do where I kind of break down and give an elementary explanation of veterans protections when the federal is government is going through a rift or reduction in force. So let's just say for background purposes, hey, not legal financial advice, just infotainment purposes only. Now, a reduction in force is all the topic. Everybody's talking about efficiency and there's being mass layoffs. Generally, I'm not saying, if you're a veteran, if you're a disabled veteran, me personally, as someone who's a veteran who is familiar and eh, intimately with this situation, just kind of dial back your level of stress because there are some protections as it relates to veterans, as it relates to disabled veterans. Remember, this is going to be an elementary overview. I definitely invite you to take a look into the statute to get more clarification. In 1944, there was the Veterans Protections Act that has since been codified or codified in the United States Code. Long story short, Congress identified that veterans needed to have certain protections, as there's persons who fought for the country, there are persons who has sustained disabilities on behalf of this country. So they wanted to make sure that they had some protections when the I don't know why I keep messing up, and I'm not re-recording this, but they wanted to make sure they had some protections when the federal government is going through a reduction in force. Now, here is where it gets interesting. What is a reduction in force? Because I can foresee a scenario where someone says, hey, this isn't a reduction in force. We're just trying to streamline the government and make things more efficient. But the US Code has a very succinct definition of what constitutes a RIF. And I think what's going on today falls in that category. Let's go ahead and take a look at the code and the statute so we can get some of the language down. 5 USC 5361 provides for the definitions that we're going to talk about. Okay, for purposes of this subchapter, employee means an employee to with whom chapter 51 of this title applies and a prevailing rate employee as defined by section 5342A2 of this title, whose employment is other than on a temporary basis. Agency has the meaning given it by section 5102 of this title. So we know what an employee is, someone who's employed, not on a temporary term basis. Agency has its own definition. Okay, here is how they articulate reduction in force. A reduction in force procedures. Okay, it says, and it doesn't necessarily explain what a reduction in force is, it explains what the procedures are. So we got to look at this language to get some guidance. Do we think what's going on now constitutes a reduction in force? Reduction in force procedures means procedures applied in carrying out any reduction in force due to reorganization, due to lack of funds or curtailment of work, or due to any other factor. And retained rate means the rate of basic pay to which an employee is entitled under section 5363B2. So, does what's going on now constitute a reduction in force? I think to this definition, I think it does. Any reduction in force due to reorganization, lack of funds, curtailment of work, or any other factor. So I definitely think this falls under the category of reduction in force. Okay, next we got to look at the order of retention. The statute lays out categories where we can just kind of get a look and see what is the order that persons should be considered to be retained in. Now, I will tell you, I took a look at the Office of Personnel Management handbook as it related to this, and it was a little confusing for me. So I actually created a chart that we're going to go in. Hopefully, it provides a little bit more granularity. Okay, next, let's take a look at the order of retention. This is the order with which persons will be retained and the factors they're going to look at. The Office of Personnel Management shall prescribe regulations for the release of competing employees and a reduction in force, which gives due effect to one, tenure of the employment. Two, military preference. Three, length of service. And four, efficiency or performance rating. So they are going to look at all of these categories when they look to identify what category of persons are going to be released. Let's keep going. Okay, Section 8 determines the employee's retention standing. Now, there's a chart I'm going to show you all that I created that kind of breaks this down. It's some confusing language. I'm going to explain that on the chart, but it'll give veterans an overview of what the process looked like and where they could potentially fall on this chart if they are impacted by a reduction in force. And we all agree that this meets the definition of a reduction in force. Retention standing basics. Four statutory retention factors are implemented in the following order on the retention register. One, tenure is the first factor and is implemented through three tenure groups on the retention register. Two, veteran preference is the second factor and is implemented through three tenure subgroups on the retention register. Service is the third factor and is implemented through each employee's service computation date on the retention register. Four, performance is the fourth factor and is implemented through additional service added for retention to the employee's service computation date on the retention register. Order of employees on the retention register. The agency lists competing employees on the retention register in the following order. Now, I'm going to go ahead and pull up this PowerPoint so we can see how it breaks down. Now, again, there is some confusion in the language of how it's written to identify which subgroup would, in fact, be the first. I think I have an interpretation of it. I invite you all to take a look at the U.S. Code and the Veterans Protection Act that I talked about that was established in 1944 to get a little bit more granularity. Okay, this following image is going to show the subgroups, how we got them broken down. I'm going to explain a little bit how the statute provides us some language to give us an idea how veterans would be categorized. But again, remember, I said there is some confusion as to the order with which reductions in force must occur. I'll give you my opinion, but I definitely invite you all to look at the Veterans Protection Acts and the accompanying United States Code statute for a little bit more granularity. This is just an elementary overview so you can have some idea how the process works and where you could potentially fall. Okay, let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, so we can see this retention register here. I kind of broke it out so we don't got to just read it and figure it out. We have on the left group one, non probationary employees at the top. Group two, probationary employees. Group three are temporary and term employees. Across the top, we have subgroup AD. Those are persons who are veterans who have a 30% or more disability. I would fall in that category. Subgroup A are veterans who have a disability, but the disability is less than 30%, 10, 20% disability. And subgroup B is non veterans. Okay. Now, again, inside each box, we can see on the left, they're going to look at the service. Service date, how much time you have in service. And then underneath at the bottom, we see the plus or minus for employees' performance. Now, when we're looking at this chart, the question is going to be DFD. Well, where do I fall and identify on this chart? Who are going to be the first people to presumably get the X? Well, again, the way the language in the OPM manual is, it's kind of vague as to the process. But if we go to the far right, the bottom corner, where we have non veterans who are term or temporary employees, those persons, the bottom right corner, would likely fall in the first category, and the persons who are going to be identified as likely being targets for a reduction in force first. Now, the question is going to be next up, who would be after them? Is it the non-veteran probationary people? If it's the veterans with a disability under 30% and the temporary term appointed employees? For purposes of this, how I read the language, this is how I read the language. Non-veterans would be identified first. Okay, again, remember, they're going to look at a service computation, but that does have a factor. So how I read it and what I've seen online through open source research, I think it's easy to identify non-veterans, temporary term employees who would be that first group of persons. The second group of persons would likely be non veterans who are on a probationary status. Okay. Then we would look into a category. Then you're probably going to go down to the middle subgroup A, group three, where you have veterans who have a lower disability rating, less than 30%, but are temporary in term. And the reason I think it goes that way is because they are going to give a certain amount of deference to a person who has a large amount of service computation time if they aren't a veteran. It's a little loosey goosey with how the language is prescribed, but like someone like me, and I talk about this in a video I did, a members only live stream. I'm a federal employee who's probationary, but I have a 30% plus disability. So I would fall, you can see subgroup AD, disability 30 plus, and group two, probationary. So what does that mean? It means the persons who would likely be subject of a rift prior to me are anybody who would fall behind me in that category. So we would have disabled vets who are probationary, who have less than 30%, non veterans who are probationary, non veterans who are temporary, non veterans, I mean, veterans who are less than 30% who are temporary term employees, or veterans who are 30 plus percent but are temporary in term. But this should actually give you some understanding where you fall on the chart. I know it's a little bit confusing, but definitely go ahead to OPM's website. They have a couple of links on their website where you can do a Google search and they kind of break it down. But I think this chart for me was the easiest to kind of explain it. I could look on this chart, see where I fall, and then get an understanding of the persons who would be subject to a rift before I am, and the persons who would probably outlast me if a rift were to impact me. I hope this video provided some type of help and some type of clarity to the situation. It's stressful times. I know everybody is going through it. Try not to worry about things you can't control. If you're a disabled veteran, a disabled veteran with 30 plus percent, you have a higher precedent than a lot of other employees out there. So I wish everybody luck. I hope everything works out for everyone. As always, if you enjoyed this content, check out the content on the screen. There's going to be more content related to some explainers, mostly attorney reactions. Y'all take care. Peace.